Out. 11 days, $380,000. A crew of marine electrical engineers flown in from Halifax and Rotterdam, working in rotating shifts with diagnostic equipment that cost more per day to operate than most Canadians earn in a month. And the Adrienne Claire, a 74-foot custom motor yacht sitting in her slip at Granville Island Marina, Vancouver, had not moved, had not powered on, had not made a sound beyond the quiet lap of water against her hull. Out. Then Conrad Hess walked down the dock in a rain jacket that had been through enough West Coast winters to stop pretending it was waterproof, carrying a coffee thermos and a soft-sided bag with a broken zipper held shut with a binder clip. He was there to return a borrowed depth gauge. He was there for 8 minutes, maybe 10. Out. By the time he left, the Adrienne Claire's engines were running for the first time in 11 days, and everyone who had been standing in the wheelhouse watching him work was very quiet. Out. The story of how that happened is also the story of what Granville Island Marina looked like on a Tuesday morning in late October, which is to say, gray in the particular way that Vancouver gets gray at that time of year, not threatening exactly, but committed, the kind of sky that has made a decision. Out. The water in False Creek was the color of old pewter, and the floating docks moved with that slow, reliable rhythm that reminded people who worked on the water of the thing they had chosen and the thing they had given up to choose it. Out. Pemberton Marine Services occupied a section of the marina that had expanded twice in the last decade. What had started as a single-family boating operation, Malcolm Pemberton's grandfather, 2 slips a hand-painted sign, was now a full-service brokerage and charter management company with 14 permanent staff, a parts and service division, and a client list that included names that appeared occasionally in the business section of the Vancouver Sun. Out. The current iteration of Pemberton Marine was run by Malcolm Pemberton, who was 51 years old, had his father's directness and his grandfather's stubbornness, and who had never, in 22 years of running the company, allowed a client's vessel to sit non-operational for more than a week without resolution. Out. The Adrienne Claire had now been non-operational for 11 days. Out. She belonged to Sandra Voss, who had built Voss Capital Group from a boutique Vancouver wealth management firm into something with offices in Toronto, Calgary, and Seattle. She was not a person who accepted explanations in place of outcomes. She had purchased the Adrienne Claire 3 years earlier, had used her for every long weekend and 2 weeks in July without incident, and had arrived at the marina on a Friday afternoon in mid-October to find that the vessel would not power on. Out. No fault codes, no warning lights the day before. The integrated control system reported everything nominal. The batteries read healthy. Every subsystem answered correctly when queried. The boat, by every electronic measure available, was perfectly fine. It simply would not start. Out. Malcolm Pemberton had West Coast Marine Electrical Solutions within 2 hours of learning the problem. W. Eames was not a local shop that handled routine maintenance. They were the firm that managed electrical systems on BC Ferry's retrofit contracts, that had twice been contracted by the federal government for marine vessel inspections, that held 3 active agreements with the Port of Vancouver for priority servicing. Out. Their lead diagnostician, a man named Gregory Alt, had 14 years of specialized marine electrical experience and a reputation within the industry for never leaving a vessel with an unsolved problem. Out. Gregory Alt had now been aboard the Adrienne Claire for 11 days. Out. He had arrived on day 1 with 2 technicians and a diagnostic array that included a Garmin Marine Network Analyzer, a CAN bus interpreter modified for proprietary marine architecture, and a thermal imaging camera used to identify resistance anomalies in wiring under load. By the end of day 2, he had confirmed what Malcolm Pemberton had already begun to suspect. The fault was not anywhere the standard equipment was designed to look. Out. Every sensor, every controller, every relay in the primary power distribution panel had been tested, cleared, and where necessary replaced. The vessel's integrated control system, a custom configuration installed during the original build, had been queried through 3 separate diagnostic interfaces. The fault did not appear. The boat would not start. Out. On day 4, Gregory Alt had placed a call to the manufacturer of the vessel's integrated control system, a marine electronics firm based in Stavanger, Norway. A remote consultation had been arranged for the following morning. Out. The Norwegian engineer who joined the call was methodical and thorough, and after 90 minutes he concluded that the problem might lie in the low-level communication layer between the control system and the primary distribution bus, and recommended a full firmware reinstallation. The package was transmitted electronically. The reinstallation was completed by end of day 5. It changed nothing. Out. On day 7, a second technician had been added to the team. A younger man, James Ford, who had spent 4 years working aboard research vessels for Fisheries and Oceans Canada before Gregory recruited him to WMS. James had asked during the afternoon briefing on day 7 whether the team had checked the secondary bonding ground at the aft electronics junction. Out. He had raised it carefully, in the way that people who are junior to someone with Gregory Alt's reputation learn to raise things that seem to contradict the established approach. Gregory had considered it for a moment and then explained, with the precision of a man who has covered every accessible ground point in the standard documentation, that bonding integrity had been verified on day 2. The aft Yacht was on the diagram. It had been checked out. James had nodded and did not bring it up again. Out. What James did not say, what he was not entirely certain of and so had not committed to, was that he was pointing at the right category of problem from a slightly wrong angle. He was close, not close enough to know it yet. Out. On the morning of day 11, Gregory Alt delivered a briefing to Malcolm Pemberton in the Marina's operations room. Out. The briefing was technically detailed, professionally presented, and arrived at a conclusion that Malcolm had been quietly dreading since day 8. The next logical diagnostic step was a full removal of the vessel's primary junction cabinet for bench testing, a process that would require the Adrian Clare to be taken out of the water, placed in the yard, and worked on in conditions that made precision electrical diagnosis significantly more difficult. Out. Estimated additional time, 7 to 10 days. Estimated additional cost, between $60,000 and $90,000. Gregory presented these figures with the careful neutrality of a man who has delivered difficult news before and has learned to let the information do the work. Out. Malcolm Pemberton listened to the entire briefing without interrupting. When Gregory finished, Malcolm said he needed the afternoon to speak with Sandra Voss. He said it without expression and walked out of the operations room toward the dock. Out. He was standing at the end of Dock C, looking at the water, when he heard the sound of footsteps on the floating planks behind him. The particular rhythm of someone walking with a specific destination in mind and not much concern for anything on either side of that straight line. He turned. Out. Conrad Hess was 57 years old and looked like a man who had spent several decades making himself useful in places that did not particularly care what he looked like. His rain jacket was a faded olive green, the cuffs worn to threads at the edges. His hands, when he shifted the soft bag he was carrying, had the texture of someone who had been doing close, careful work with them for a very long time. He was not a client of Pemberton Marine Services. He was not a member of the Marina. Out. He was the owner and operator of Hess Marine Repair, a one-man shop that operated out of a rented unit in a light industrial building on West 2nd Avenue, and he was on Dock C because he had borrowed a depth gauge from a friend who kept his boat in slip 14 and he was returning it. Out. He would have walked the length of the dock, left the gauge on the deck of the Kathleen B with a handwritten note on the handle the way he'd done twice before, and been back in his truck inside of 10 minutes. Out. Instead, as he passed the Adrian Clare, he slowed. Out. Not enough that anyone watching would have necessarily noticed. He did not stop walking, but something in the pace changed, the slight, involuntary adjustment of a person whose attention has been caught by something their eyes are still processing. He looked at the Adrian Clare for approximately 3 seconds as he passed the stern. His gaze moved across the swim platform, up the transom, and stopped for a moment at a specific point near the base of the aft rail fitting. Out. Then he continued walking. Out. Malcolm Pemberton had turned back to the water and was staring at the inlet when he heard from somewhere behind him a quiet and unhurried question. Out. Is that a Lund Custom build? Out. Malcolm turned. The man in the olive jacket had set the soft bag down on the dock planks and was looking at the Adrian Clare with the kind of attention that is not admiration exactly, but something more precise than that. Out. Malcolm said yes. Out. The man nodded. 2019 or 2020? Out. Malcolm said 2020, commissioned in the spring. Out. The man looked at the vessel for another moment. Has she been having trouble? Out. It was not the question Malcolm had expected, and for a reason he could not entirely articulate, he answered it honestly. He gave the short version, the symptoms, the duration, the team currently aboard, the briefing he'd just received. The kind of summary you give when you are exhausted and someone has asked a question that doesn't require you to pretend. Out. The man listened without interrupting. When Malcolm finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, what configuration did they order on the bonding system, standard or extended? Out. Malcolm said he didn't know. Out. The man nodded again, as though this answered something. He looked at the Adrian Clare for another few seconds. Then he picked up his bag and walked toward the stern of the vessel. Out. Malcolm watched him. Out. Do you want to go aboard? Malcolm said. It came out more like a statement than a question. Out. The man Conrad Hess, though Malcolm didn't know his name yet, looked back once, if that's all right. Out. Malcolm followed him. Out. Gregory Alt was in the wheelhouse when they came up the stern steps. He was reviewing the previous day's diagnostic logs on a tablet. and he looked up with the expression of a man who has learned to assess unfamiliar visitors quickly and accurately. He assessed Conrad Hess in approximately 2 seconds and placed him incorrectly in a category that did not require significant attention. Out. Malcolm said that this person had some questions about the vessel. Gregory's response was professional and measured and contained, beneath its surface, the particular kind of resistance that people develop when they have been working a difficult problem for a long time and are not interested in input from outside the established framework. Out. Conrad did not appear to notice this or did not appear to mind. He looked around the wheelhouse with the same quality of attention he had directed at the transom from the dock, not taking inventory, reading. Out. He asked Gregory a question directly, the tone of it quiet, curious, entirely without competition. Have you had a chance to look at the extended bonding circuit on this configuration? Not the standard aft junction. There's a secondary point that Lund added to a specific build window for vessels with the extended electronics package. It's not in the documentation they released to third-party service providers. Out. Gregory Alt set the tablet down on the console. Bonding integrity was confirmed on day 2. The aft junction is on the diagram. We tested it. Out. Conrad said, the one on the diagram. Right. He looked at the wheelhouse instruments for a moment. This vessel has a supplementary bonding point that doesn't appear on the standard Lund service documentation. It was added internally for the 2020 builds that came with the extended electronics configuration. There was a resonance issue they were managing in the low-voltage control layer. Out. The point exists between the primary distribution bus and the aft electronics cabinet, inside a secondary chase that runs below the helm station's sole. Out. Gregory looked at him the way that people look at someone who has just said something they are not entirely sure how to categorize. That's a significant claim. Out. It is, Conrad said, without any particular emphasis. He looked at Malcolm Pemberton. I can show you where it is if you want to open the sole. Out. Malcolm looked at Gregory. Out. Gregory said that without documentation, he couldn't verify the claim, and that opening the helm sole on a vessel under active diagnostic contract introduced liability considerations that needed to be managed carefully. Both of these things were true. Neither of them was the reason Gregory said them at that particular moment. Out. Malcolm looked at Conrad. Who are you? Out. Conrad answered the way he answered most questions briefly without anything left over. Conrad Hess. I run a repair shop on West 2nd. He paused. Before that, I was with Lund Custom Marine in North Vancouver for 9 years. I left as their head of electrical systems integration. Another pause shorter. I was the project lead on the extended electronics configuration for the 2020 build series. I wrote the bonding spec for this class of vessel. Out. The wheelhouse was quiet for a moment. Out. James Ford, who had been standing near the aft door with the practiced stillness of someone who has learned to occupy space without drawing attention to himself during moments of professional tension, stopped pretending to review the wiring schematic in his hand. Out. Gregory Alt's expression did not change in any dramatic way. Men who have spent enough time being the most professional person in any given professional situation develop a kind of structural composure that survives most impacts. But something behind it shifted, a very slight recalibration, the kind that happens when incoming information doesn't fit the existing model, and the model is too honest to simply discard what it's receiving. Out. Malcolm Pemberton looked at Conrad Hess for a long moment. Then he said, what do you need? Out. Gregory said that he had concerns about the liability framework before any third-party access to the vessel's systems. His voice was still measured, still professional. His arms had moved without visible decision to a position slightly crossed in front of him. Out. Malcolm looked at him. 11 days, he said. $380,000. Then he looked at Conrad. What do you need? Out. Conrad asked for a cordless screwdriver, a multimeter, and a flashlight. He said it with the tone of a man describing things that are about to happen, not requesting permission for them. Out. He found the access point for the helm station sole in the position he expected it to be. He did not consult diagram. He did not ask anyone where to look. His hands moved with the economy of someone performing an action that has become physical memory rather than conscious procedure. Out. The sole panel lifted on the second try, revealing the cavity beneath the helm station. Cable runs, conduit, the back of the instrument mounting frame, and a wiring cluster that to anyone looking at it for the first time appeared entirely ordinary. Insulation intact, connectors clean, no visible corrosion, no heat marks, no physical damage of any kind. Out. Gregory Alt looked at it from the doorway. His posture changed, barely, in a way that suggested he had expected to find something and had not. Out. Conrad directed the flashlight beam along the run of the supplementary bonding lead to the point where it terminated in a connector block mounted on a small aluminum bracket. He held the light there for several seconds. Then he placed the multimeter probes, one on the bonding lead, one on the chassis reference, and waited for the reading. Out. He looked at it for longer than the number required, long enough to be certain. Out. Then he held the display toward the wheelhouse. Out. The resistance value was not catastrophic. It would not have thrown a fault code. It would not have illuminated any warning light or appeared as an anomaly in any of the diagnostic reports Gregory's team had generated over 11 days. But it was above the threshold that the vessel's low-voltage start-enable circuit required to confirm bonding integrity before allowing the main power sequence to complete. Not dramatically above. Enough. Out. James Ford looked at the reading. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said almost to himself, temperature dependent. Out. Conrad looked at him. Out. James said, the resistance is higher because of the ambient conditions. October mornings in Vancouver. We've been running diagnostics once the boats had time to sit in the heated slip. By mid-morning the whole assembly's at a different temperature than it is at cold soak. Out. Conrad said, there's a microfracture in the conductor at the compression point. It's not a break. The circuit is technically continuous. But the effective cross-section is reduced enough that in cold ambient conditions, the resistance climbs above the start-enable threshold. Once the temperature comes up and the metal expands slightly, the resistance drops back into range. The system looks healthy because every time your team ran a diagnostic, it was healthy. Out. Gregory said nothing. There was at that moment nothing in his professional vocabulary that had been designed for this specific situation. He had run a correct process on an incorrectly scoped problem. He knew it, and he knew that the man crouching beside the helm's soul knew it, and he knew that the knowledge was mutual and that no amount of careful framing was going to change what the multimeter had read. Out. James Ford looked at the reading one more time. Then he looked at Conrad. Then he looked at the floor of the wheelhouse in front of him, doing arithmetic that had nothing to do with electrical resistance. Out. Conrad straightened up and looked around the wheelhouse for a moment. Then he walked back to where he had left his bag near the stern door, opened it, and took out a coil of marine-grade bonding wire, a crimping tool, a short sheet of fine-grit abrasive, and 2 ring terminals. The bag also contained the depth gauge he had come to return, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small notebook with a cracked spine. Out. Gregory made one more attempt. It was the attempt of a man who has not decided to concede the full territory and is working with what remains. He said, correctly, that the vessel required a proper repair through the appropriate service channels, that a bridge fix introduced its own documentation and warranty considerations, and that Lund Custom Marine's authorized service network should be involved before anything was modified on the bonding system. Out. Every one of those things was accurate. Out. Conrad said, he's right. Out. Gregory's expression shifted slightly, in the direction of something that might eventually become relief if the conversation continued in the right direction. Out. Conrad continued, this is a bridge. It'll let the vessel run safely, but the correct fix is a full replacement of the compromised bonding lead with a factory-spec terminated connector. Lund will have the kit. They stock it for the 2020 extended configuration class. Call them and reference the vessel's build sequence number. They'll know exactly which part. He looked at Malcolm. Until the kit arrives, don't run the vessel in cold soak conditions without a warm-up period. Out. 20 minutes at idle with the cabin heater running before you attempt main power sequence. Out. Malcolm Pemberton was watching Conrad with the expression of a person assembling a picture from pieces that had, until recently, been scattered across a table in no particular order. Out. He said, how did you know this vessel was from that build window? You looked at her for 3 seconds from the dock. Out. Conrad said, the aft rail fitting bracket. Lund used a modified geometry on the 2020 extended configuration builds to accommodate the supplementary bonding chase routing. The bracket has a slightly different profile at the base where it meets the transom. I recognized it. I also caught the last 3 digits of the build plate number on the swim platform. They fall within the sequence I was working on in my last year at Lund. Out. He said it without particular emphasis, the way a person states a fact that is true and does not require decoration. Out. Conrad worked on the bonding lead for 19 minutes. He cleaned the terminal surface with the abrasive paper, working at the pace of someone for whom the action was so familiar that the pace was simply the correct pace. Not fast, not slow, but exactly right. He measured the replacement section twice before cutting it. He seated the ring terminal in the crimp tool and applied 1 clean compression, then checked it by hand, then applied a slight pull test. Out. He measured the resistance at the new connection. The multimeter returned a number that was 22 times lower than what it had read before. Out. He connected the bridge lead, confirmed both termination points, and closed the access panel. The latch engaged with a small, solid sound. Out. He put his tools back into the bag, one at a time, in the same order they had come out. He closed the zipper as far as it would go and refastened the binder clip. Out. Then he looked at Malcolm and gave a single nod. Out. Malcolm Pemberton went to the helm. He pressed the main power sequence initiation button, waited for the low-voltage system to complete its bonding integrity check, and when the status indicator held green, not flickered, not hesitated, held, he pressed the engine start. Out. The sound that came from below was not what the word start typically evokes. It was not a cough or a catch or the tentative engagement of something waking up uncertain. It was full, immediate, and entirely confident, the sound of 480 horsepower recognizing no obstacle between itself and its function. Out. It came up through the helm station's soul and through the deck and registered somewhere below conscious attention, the way large mechanical things do when they are operating correctly in enclosed spaces. The Adrian Clare had not made that sound in 11 days. The water around the hull began to move with the low vibration of an engine at idle. Out. James Ford, who had been standing in the doorway between the wheelhouse and the aft deck, closed his eyes for approximately 2 seconds when the engine turned over. When he opened them, he was looking at the water beyond the stern, and his expression was the expression of a person who has been carrying a specific thought for 4 days and has just been told that the thought was correct. Out. Gregory Ault was standing near the port console. His hands were at his sides. His face held an expression of careful neutrality that required visible and sustained effort. Out. Malcolm Pemberton let the engine run. He did not touch any other controls. He simply stood at the helm and listened to the Adrian Clare doing what she had been built to do. Out. After 90 seconds, he reached forward and shut her down. The silence that followed was not the same silence as the 11 days before it. That silence had been the silence of something unresolved. This one was different. Out. Malcolm turned around. Conrad Hess was already picking up his bag from beside the aft door. Out. Malcolm said, "I don't know your rate." Out. "I came to return a depth gauge." Out. Malcolm said, "That's not what I'm asking about." Out. Conrad looked at him for a moment. "The vessel needs the factory kit when it arrives from Lund. Whoever does the install needs to know the exact torque spec for the terminal block on the supplementary bonding point. It's not in the documentation they'll send with the kit." Out. He paused. "I know the spec." Out. Malcolm held his gaze. "I'd like you here when the part arrives." Out. Conrad said, "I can do that." Out. Malcolm said he would have his office send a service agreement to whatever address was on Conrad's business card. It was not a question. It was Malcolm Pemberton doing what he had done for 22 years, converting an open variable into a settled matter before anyone had the chance to reopen it. Out. Conrad put the card on the helm console and walked toward the stern steps. Out. He was stepping off the Adrian Clare onto the dock when Gregory Ault appeared at the top of the steps behind him. Gregory stood there for a moment, looking not at Conrad but at a point somewhere past his shoulder. Then he said, without quite looking at him, "When did you know?" Out. Conrad looked at the water in the slip. The engine warmth was still coming up through the deck behind them, and the morning had brightened slightly in the way Vancouver mornings sometimes do when the cloud cover thins without entirely breaking. Out. He said, "When I saw the bracket." Out. Gregory said nothing. Out. Conrad said, "You ran a correct process. You ran it on the information you had." Out. Gregory said, "We should have asked for the full build specification on day one." Out. Conrad said, "Yes." Out. The word was not unkind. It was not a verdict. It was simply accurate, in the way Conrad Hess tended to be accurate about things. Out. Gregory went back inside. Conrad picked up his bag and walked the length of Dock C to slip 14. Where the Kathleen B was tied alongside in the same position she'd been in for the better part of 3 years. He set the depth gauge on the deck with a handwritten note folded around the handle. Then he walked back along the dock to the parking area. Out. James Ford was leaning against the railing at the dock entrance when Conrad passed. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and was looking at the water in the way that people look at things when they are not actually seeing what they are looking at. Out. He said, without turning, "I brought up the secondary bonding check on day 7. Out. Conrad stopped walking. Out. James said, "He dismissed it, said we'd already confirmed the aft junction." He was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't wrong about the category. I just didn't know enough to know which specific point." Out. Conrad said, "You knew enough to know where the problem wasn't. That's how you find where it is." Out. James looked at him. He had the expression of a person who has been given information that will take some time to locate correctly, but who knows already that it belongs somewhere important. Out. Conrad said, "The spec work I did at Lund is in the public record. There's a technical paper in the Canadian Journal of Marine Engineering, 2017, Secondary Bonding Architecture for Integrated Low-Voltage Systems. If you read it, you'll know more than I did when I started. Out. James said, "Why did you leave Lund?" Out. Conrad looked at the water for a moment. "My son was 8. His mother had been gone for 3 years. I wanted to be home for dinner." Out. James did not say anything to this. There was nothing to say that would have improved on the silence. Out. Conrad walked to the parking area and put his bag on the passenger seat of his truck, a mid-2000s Silverado that looked like it had made peace with every pothole it had ever encountered. He sat for a moment before starting it, not thinking about anything in particular, in the way that a person sits after a thing is finished that needed to be finished. Out. Malcolm Pemberton came out of the Marina office and across the parking area while Conrad was still sitting there. He walked to the driver's side window and stood with his hands in his jacket pockets. Out. He said, "Sandra Voss is going to want to speak with you." Out said, "She doesn't need to." Out. Malcolm said, "She's going to anyway." He looked at the truck for a moment, then at Conrad. 8 days ago, if you had come in through the front office instead of Dock C, I probably would have had someone escort you out before you got to the boats." Out. He said it the way a person says a true thing that is not comfortable to say. Out. He held Conrad's gaze for a moment, then walked back across the parking lot toward the Marina office. Out. Conrad started the truck. He took the route along 2nd Avenue that ran past his shop. Not because it was faster, but because he had driven it enough times that it was simply the way he went. The morning traffic had thinned in the way Vancouver traffic does when you get off the main corridors, and the drive was quiet except for the sound of the heater working through a cold that had settled in overnight and had not yet decided to lift. Out. On the seat beside him, the multimeter sat in its canvas case, leads coiled the way he always coiled them. The depth gauge was gone, returned, note written, errand complete. The Adrian Clare was running. Out. He turned off 2nd onto the side street that led to the industrial block and pulled into the parking space behind his shop. The sign above the bay door said Hess Marine Repair in block letters that he had painted himself 10 years ago and had never found a reason to change. He sat for a moment after he shut the engine off, listening to the tick of the cooling metal. Out. Then he got out, unlocked the bay door, and went to work. Out. I keep thinking about the binder clip. Out. Conrad Hess walked onto that dock carrying a bag held shut with a binder clip, returning a borrowed depth gauge, and he solved in 19 minutes what a team of credentialed engineers couldn't solve in 11 days. That detail stays with me, not because it's ironic, though it is, but because of what it says about the relationship between a person and their work. Conrad didn't need the right bag, he needed the right eyes. Out. What happened on Dock C that morning was cause and effect, plain and simple. Gregory Alt's team failed not because they were incompetent, but because they built a fence around the problem before they understood its shape. They defined the scope on day 1 and then defended that scope for 10 more days. Every decision after that, every part replaced, every firmware reinstalled, every consultation fee paid, flowed from that first quiet act of closing off. Out. The cause was certainty arrived at too early. The effect was $380,000 and 11 days of nothing. Out. Conrad was different, and I think the difference came from something he had built over a long time. Not credentials, but integrity of attention. He looked at the Adrian Clare for 3 seconds from the dock, and he saw what he saw without deciding in advance what he was looking for. That's harder than it sounds. Most of us, when we look at a problem we're supposed to solve, are already half looking for the solution we expect to find. Out. Conrad had spent 9 years putting that vessel's electrical architecture together from first principles. He had no gap between what he knew and what he'd done. That's what real knowledge looks like, and it's built through honesty. The honesty to keep learning after you think you already know, to stay curious about the thing you made, to never mistake familiarity for understanding. Out. And then there's what Conrad chose to do with what he knew. He almost walked off the dock. He had a reason to leave. It wasn't his job, it wasn't his vessel, and the man running the diagnostic operation had already made it clear that unsolicited input wasn't welcome. He left a note on the depth gauge and he was done, but something in him couldn't quite finish the walk. I don't think it was ambition. Out. I think it was the particular discomfort of a person with good instincts who knows something is wrong and has to decide whether that knowing carries an obligation. Out. He decided it did. Out. That's the thing about character. It doesn't show up in the easy moments. It shows up in the moment Conrad stood at the dock entrance and turned back. It showed up in the way he said he's right to Gregory Alt, giving credit where it was due even after everything. It showed up in the way he told James Ford exactly where to find the technical paper, because James had been pointed in the right direction all along and deserved to know it. Out. There's a version of this story where Conrad walks to his truck, drives back to his shop on West 2nd, and the Adrian Clare sits in that slip for another week. Nobody would have blamed him. But I think he would have felt it. That quiet, specific weight of a thing left undone that you were the only one who could do. Out, he picked up the bag, he walked back down the dock, he did the work. Out. That's the whole of it, and I don't think it needs much more than that.